Hi. Essential D1 is a small 12-track sample-based digital drum machine from Donner. A company that's known for making a broad range of relatively inexpensive instruments like guitars, keyboards, drums, and effects. The D1 is fairly easy to use, has plenty of hands-on controls, a few fun performance features, and you can load up your own samples into it. In this video, I'll take a look at what it can do, compare it to the competition, and talk about a few important things you need to know before buying it, as well as play you its factory patterns at the end. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Donner sent me the D1 and B1. Other than that, no money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. Okay, let's start with an overview. The Essential D1, or D1 for short, has 12 sample-based tracks. Each channel is represented by one of the 12 color and velocity sensitive pads, and you can play them live or step sequence them into the sequencer. The two pads on the bottom left are used for various speeds of note repeats, and then the two pads on the right can be used for fills. So if this is the basic pattern, this is fill A, and this is fill B. And then with using the beat button as a shift, these can be used to store one of 4 beats in a pattern. So back in this example, this is beat number 1, and then this is beat number 2, beat number 3, and beat number 4 within what is called a song here. Beat transitions are quantized to the bar and are seamless, as you heard here. You can store more songs on board, but those transitions aren't seamless. They're pretty quick, but not quite clean. If your audience had enough to drink, they might not notice. You've got 4 faders to control the levels of 4 of the 12 channels at a time. And as you swap between the banks of the 4 channels that you're controlling, you can see that these are nicely color coordinated to help you see what it is that you're controlling. When you actually edit levels, you'll also see that on screen. The rest of the buttons' functions are labeled on the panel above the buttons, and there's a shift for various functions that are labeled under the buttons. On the top are 8 knobs, a combination of encoders and pots. Next to the screen is a push encoder that lets you select items. The screen itself is relatively low contrast, which looks okay if you're directly above it, but fades out when viewed from an angle. The next 5 encoders are touch encoders, and they control various channel or track parameters. These 2 parameters aren't labeled because they're different on a per track basis. So sometimes they'll control an attack, sometimes they'll control filter or distortion, sometimes they'll control sample start and end points. More on this later. Then you've got 2 pot knobs, one for the return level of the master delay and reverb, which you can send on a track-by-track basis, and one for the master volume. There's also a master compressor, which you can edit in the Master Effects menu with a bunch of compression-related parameters. All the tracks or channels are sample-based. Samples are in mono, but you can pan each track separately, and the effects are in stereo. You can't sample using the D1, but you can load up your own samples using their companion computer app, and the company says there's 4 gigabytes of free storage available on board. In terms of project structure, the main umbrella for what you create here is called a song, and then a song includes a reference to a kit, which is all the samples loaded up onto all the channels, and also a reference to 4 beats. A beat is the pattern that triggers all the samples, and like I mentioned earlier, you can swap between 4 beats using the beat and one of these 4 buttons. 4 beats and 2 fills per beat. Each beat, by the way, can be up to 4 bars long, so that means either 16, 32, 48, or 64 steps. You may have noticed, by the way, that when I touched this knob, sometimes a menu will pop up because of the touch sensitivity of these encoders. I think it would certainly have been better if this encoder was on this side of the screen so that you don't accidentally trigger this pop-up, or if there was a way to disable these if they annoy you too much. Sequences are in multiples of 16 steps without speed scaling. You can also parameter lock various parameters on a per step basis, including sub-step triggers. Even though the core project here is called a song, there's no real song mode, though you can choose to set playback mode to auto, in which case the beats will start at whatever the current beat is and then cycle through the 4 beat slots. I don't know why it skipped 1 here, maybe a bug. Anyway, after 2 should come 3. And you can interrupt this if you want. So say I wanted to go to beat 1 or beat slot 1. It'll do that and then automatically continue on to cycle through the beat slots. If you're not in any menu, the top half of the screen will say the name of the beat in the current beat slot, which is 2. This is beat slot 1. And then the bottom half will give you the name of the active channel and the name of the sample that's loaded into that channel. D1 can hold up to 64 songs or projects at a time. And remember, each song references 1 kit. You can store up to 64 kits on board. Kits are collections of 12 samples, 1 per channel, and up to 4 beats in a song, and you've got a total of 256 storage slots for beats. In terms of factory content, the first 16 slots are loop masters, patterns, songs, and samples. I'll play them for you at the end of this video. The rest of the slots are empty. In terms of build, D1 is plastic and light, but it doesn't feel flimsy at all. It doesn't feel premium either, but things are overall okay, no complaints, except maybe for the faders that are a bit hard to move and don't spark joy. It sits at an angle, which is a good thing I wish more instruments would do, and the top part of the panel is shiny and a fingerprint magnet if those things bother you. The velocity-sensitive pads are okay. I did find them to re-trigger, double triggers every now and then. In terms of connectivity, you've got 2 1/4-inch stereo outputs, full-size MIDI DIN in and out, which is a good thing. There's a stereo auxiliary input MIDI jack that goes directly to the outputs so that you can mix in another instrument, but you can't apply any of the internal effects or compressor to it. And it hard pans mono instrument unless you sort of wiggle the cable a bit. Say, for example, if you want to pair a mono instrument like the B1 to it. Then there's a headphone output and USB-C for MIDI and for sending samples back and forth using the Donner control app. D1 comes with a 9-volt power adapter. You can't power it via USB, nor can you send audio back and forth over USB. Okay, let's dive in and take a look at the details, and I'll start with the 12 tracks or channels. The important thing to know about them is that they're not identical. Some parameters are shared and some not. Let's talk about the shared parameters first. Once you've loaded up a sample, you can edit its pitch in semitones, an octave up and an octave down. And this isn't time stretched, so if you pitch a sample down, it gets longer. And if you pitch it up, it gets shorter. Then each channel or sample slot also has decay control if it takes things too far. Like I mentioned, samples are in mono, but you can pan them left and right. And then as long as you bring the effects returns up, you can also choose to send each sample either to the reverb with shift or to the delay, or both, of course. The effects return knob controls the overall level of both the delay and the reverb, but each channel gets its own send level. So for example, here the snare gets sent to the delay, but other tracks aren't. Level, of course, is also a per track parameter. And there's a pickup or catch mode. So say if I turn the fader all the way down, move to bank B, and want to edit this parameter, then it won't immediately go down. Rather, you can take it down gradually without any parameter jumps, which is a good thing. Okay, so for those parameters, the ones I talked about up until now, the 12 tracks or channels are the same. Here's how they're different. First, the maximum length of sample you can load varies per track. It's 3 seconds for all of the 8 bottom tracks except the OH and CR, open hat or crash channels. These two can go up to a little bit over 11 seconds. And of course you can load other sounds than hats and crashes onto them. And then the top 4 channels all can go up to 58 seconds. Now again, these names are just a guide, so it's not that you can only load samples into the 4 sample tracks. You can load samples into any of the other tracks. It's just that the sample length varies per channel, and to edit the sample that's on the channel, you press the encoder when the channel is selected and cycle through the samples that are available. There's no way to preview sounds, but you can press in and swap samples this way. There is one caveat though. You can only load samples that are placed into the specific folder for any one of the 8 channels on the bottom or the 9th folder for all the channels on top. So for example, you'll notice if I hit the CH channel, I'll see different samples here. Then the kicks. So all of these can only access their folder. And then these 4 share the sample folder, which again can be anything you like. This is some of the factory content, but you can drag and drop your own here using the control app. Having to think in advance which channel you're going to put a sample in is quite an annoyance, especially since the channel parameters are different. So let's talk about those. Param 1 and Param 2 are actually totally different for each of the 8 tracks, the 8 bottom tracks, and for the 9th channel or track type here on top, the sample channel. The top 4 channels, their parameters are identical. Param 1 is the sample start. It only has a resolution, by the way, of 127 steps. And then sample end. There's no reverse. Obviously, it would be nice if you could reverse and then see the actual sample or maybe zoomed in to help trim it to a specific spot. So that's the easy part. Then for these 8 tracks, like I mentioned, Param 1 and Param 2 are different on a per track basis. So for example, for the bass drum, Param 1 is a low pass filter, and you control the cutoff. And then Param 2 is a very nice, I might say, distortion. But this is actually the only track or only channel in which you get distortion. Then for the SD or snare channel, it's a high pass filter with resonance in this case. And for the LT track, again, low pass filter, this time with a bit crusher or bit crasher as it's called here. It's a bit nuanced, but you can hear it a bit better on other types of samples. I wish it would go more aggressive than just 8, but it's either 8, 12, or 16. HC is, again, high pass, this time with a humanized function. So the humanized function isn't actually a direct sound design function. If you turn it on, then when the sequence is running, it will randomize the velocity for this channel. Then for the closed hat or CH channel, we've got an attack parameter. This goes, of course, with the decay as well. And then another humanized function, which is great. OH, attack, and no function for the second parameter for some reason. Then there's a bandpass filter here with resonance. And a high pass again with no parameter here for some reason for the CR for the crash channel. So obviously it would have been nice if every track had all the parameters. I don't think it's that bad that there are different parameters per track or channel. I just think that along with the limitation of deciding in advance which sample goes into which folder makes things more tedious. The solution is, I think, just let us load any sample into any channel as opposed to just the ones that are in its folder. Okay, so those are the 12 channels and how they're similar and different. Let's take a look at sequencing. You can either step sequence or record finger drumming live into the sequencer. Either way, there are a few things you can do to set things up. You set the bar length of the pattern. Again, you can't set anything but bars, at least not in the current firmware. You can set the initial step velocity if you're going to be step sequencing, and you can set quantization. I'm going to intentionally turn that to off. And that's important because we don't want to accidentally quantize things. If we wanted, we could also set the tempo of the project to whatever we want. There's a metronome as well. Clear all clears all the patterns, all the parts. Then to sequence, you just select the track you want to sequence and then hold Shift and sequence or record to enter step sequencing mode. And we can enter triggers into the pattern. I can also select a different channel with Shift and then enter the steps for that. If our pattern had more than one bar, we could hold Shift and press one of these buttons to move to different bars within the pattern. In this case, I set it to just one bar, so we're only on the first bar. And I could repeat this process to other tracks. Let's maybe remove the snares, go to one more track. Let's do something melodic. Okay, so that's the basics of step sequencing, more or less. Let's maybe increase the level of this track a bit more. Okay, let's talk about parameter locks. So if I wanted to change the pitch of one of these stabs, let's say this one, you can long press the pad, then it turns pink, then this menu shows up, and I could choose any parameter I wanted, say for example, pitch, and edit that. Or of course change any other parameter like velocity, sample, and let's not do that. Substeps are down here. So I could add, say, a ratchet. Okay. We can also change the velocity of a ratchet, by the way, with Shift. So let's make this high and then this a bit lower, so levels of the ratchets will ramp up. Yeah, nice. Anyway, so that's parameter locking. You can choose to lock parameters on other steps, by the way, just by selecting them as long as they're pink. So I could have, say, velocity at whatever here and at whatever else. Here we go, here. It's a bit tedious. It would have been great, obviously, if you could just edit pitch with the pitch knob and decay with the decay knob rather than go through this back and forth with the menus. Unfortunately, that doesn't work, so I can't just turn this knob. What this will do will change pitch globally. And so if I hop back and forth, you'll see it's now -10 on both. I could then go ahead into here and edit that, and then you'll see this little asterisk. So that means that it's different than the global pitch change. By the way, there's a handy undo feature. So if you exit step sequencing mode and then re-enter it, hit play, and then just let's go wild, add a lot of craziness. Let's maybe add a crash here. Anyway, if I didn't like that, I could just hit undo as long as I didn't exit step sequencing mode. So Shift and undo. And it goes back to the way it was, which is also a nice performance feature, I think. And you can also sequence the fills in a beat. So if you hold sequence and press either fill A or fill B, it'll start to blink. And let's maybe keep the kicks, but add a whole bunch of snares everywhere. Let's see what happens. Exit this. That's my pattern and my snares. And we have a fill. These are only 1 bar long, by the way, and they get stored along with the beat. So that's step sequencing. You can also record live into a pattern. You can choose to turn the metronome on or off for that, which we'll hear if I hit record. Not necessary for now. And yeah, let's turn it off and just play something in. Say,
yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
What you play in is recorded with velocity. So if I go into one of these tracks and choose a step, hopefully we'll see, a different velocity per step. You can't automate any of the other parameters when recording live, so you'll need to do that manually, at least not in the current firmware. And then I can only assume that I didn't play these properly in time. If we go into substeps, you can see that magically I did. Let's maybe intentionally play things out of time. And go back to step sequencing. Okay, so now these are blinking, which means that there are substeps in them, or out of time steps. And if we go into that, we'll see that over here, for example, or over here and over here. Anyway, the reason I'm mentioning this is to talk about quantization. So remember I said earlier, you want to have quantization off. And the reason is that if quantization is on, the minute you press this button, it'll quantize everything. Quantization options are from pretty extreme to triplets, 16 triplets, 30 seconds. So if I wanted to quantize this masterpiece, which I think is totally unjustified, let's say to sixteenths, then I could either, and this is where you need to be really careful, either hold quantize and choose a track. Let's get out of step sequencing mode. Hold quantize and choose a track or channel, in which case it will only quantize that specific channel. Let's try that. Okay. Sample 4. Not too much damage because we're in none. Let's try to be extreme to sixteenths. So again, quantize. Lost all its charm, I think. Or if I press this, it'll just quantize everything. So again, keep this at off, I think, unless you intentionally want to quantize something. All recording, by the way, is unquantized initially. There are 12 substeps per step, and if you want, let's just add a bunch of hi-hats. There's also swing. So if we hold shift and this, we'll get to swing. Does it go both ways? No. And then last thing for sequencing, once you've created your masterpiece, this is an important one, and another thing that, again, at least as of the current firmware, is pretty annoying, and you have to remember, you need to save not only the song, which you can save into an empty slot, and you can rename if you want. Let's not talk about that. Just hit save, keep that, save. So now allegedly we saved the song, but no, we didn't, because we didn't save the beat. A song is just a link to a beat. It doesn't actually save the beat when you save the song. You have to hit save and beat, then choose a new beat slot or overwrite one. Rename this. Let's just call this beat 92C and save that. And if we swapped out any of the samples in the kit, you need to save the kit as well into an existing kit slot or overwrite one of the kit slots. Let's say call this lit kit, because it certainly is. Hit save. And just to make sure, save this song because it's referencing potentially different kits. Let's save it here into this slot. One of the advantages of the software, by the way, is that you can rename stuff from the software, so you don't have to mess with this here. So that's sequencing. Let's look at a few performance functions, and for that, maybe load one of the factory patterns to keep things interesting. Let's go for this one. So you've got mutes. To mute tracks, you need to hold the mute button. There's no mute mode, unfortunately. Hold the mute button, and you can mute any track you like. There's also a solo function. You hold shift and solo, and then choose the tracks you want to solo. That's to keep it further interesting. Load up a different pattern. Let's say jackin'. Okay, there are fills. We talked about that before. And you can choose different beats. So this is beat 1, beat 2, beat 3, and beat 4. Note repeats are a fun performance function which you can play around with whether a song is playing or not. Up to 64ths. I asked Donner, by the way, note repeats aren't pressure sensitive, but they're planning on adding that in a future firmware update, which would be cool. Let's look at the effects just a bit more in detail. The reverb. Has a few interesting parameters. There's high pass and low pass filtering for the reverb, which I think is very useful. And then there are a few reverb types. Church, hall, and room. Even longer decay. And tone control. Let's reduce the snare's reverb and take a listen to the various delays. Go into effects, delay parameters. There's filtering, which is always useful. Tempo sync or not. And there are two delay types, digital. Sort of just simple repeating delay. And then there's a BBD, bucket reggae, with a bit more character. And let's bring up feedback. Does go into self-oscillation, which is fun to play around with. Oops. So those are the effects. Let's take a quick look at the Donner Control app. This lets you browse the samples on the device, create, edit, and rename kits, and transfer samples onto the D1. The nice thing about this app is that you don't need to move back and forth from and to drive mode. Everything just works seamlessly, and once you transfer a sample, it's immediately available on the device. Okay, let's talk about the pros and cons for the Essential D1 from Donner. On the pros side, it's very easy to use. You probably won't need to look at the manual much, which isn't a good thing for the views of this video, but is for the D1. Transferring user samples using the Control app is fast and immediate. It converts samples to the right wave format, so you don't need to think about it. The D1 has plenty of hands-on controls, 12 tracks with 12 voice polyphony. The 4 gigabytes of internal storage is pretty impressive, and the color coordinated control between the pads and the faders works well. It supports unquantized recording with multiple substeps. Overall, it has a clean output and the effects sound good, I think. Then another pro is this screen. It's not great by any means, but compared to the similar priced competition, at least it exists, which means you can see important information. For example, sample names as you pick them from lists, which can get increasingly long. It only shows the first 9 letters of the sample's name, so be mindful how you name them, but still a very welcome feature. Same goes for project names and numerous other things on the interface. It's always better to see what's going on than not. So those are the pros. On the cons side, I'm not going to read out to you all the features an MPC or Digitact have because they cost 3 to 4 times as much as this. When looking at similarly priced alternatives, the Teenage Engineering KO2, Electron Model Samples, Circuit Rhythm, and Volca Sample, that's where I think it becomes a fairer fight competitively. There's no right answer. On the physical hardware side, meaning things that can't be changed with a firmware update, my top con compared to some of its competitors is that D1 isn't a sampler. It only plays back samples you load onto it. It also plays back only mono samples, though you can pan them, so it's not that out of the ordinary for its price range, but it would have been nice to be pleasantly surprised. The next con is that it's hard to read the labels unless you're in a very brightly lit environment like this one, especially if those labels are close to a lit pad. It's a bummer that the buttons all look the same. Backlit labels would have been fantastic. I already mentioned the faders don't spark joy, and the screen encoder would have been much better placed on the other side. You probably saw me during this video accidentally touch the encoders, which bring up a pop-up that covers whatever it is that you're looking through as you scroll through various parameters. I guess somewhat of a fix would be to disable touch sensitivity if you want to. I know that I would disable it for sure. Then on the firmware side, as I was going through the D1, I sent Donner a bunch of questions about things I thought were missing, just to make sure I wasn't wrong about something. To a few of those, they responded that those are planned in a soon-to-be-released firmware update by the end of September 2024. They agreed that I share this list with you, so here are a list of cons that should be fixed soon. While I don't think you should ever buy something based on features that aren't here yet, within a couple of months, quite a few issues will be addressed. So that aside, I want to focus on a few important things that aren't on the list for immediate updates. Probably most annoying is that each of the first 8 tracks can only see samples in their folder, and then these 4 tracks can only see samples in their folder, which means you have to plan ahead where you want each sample to be when you transfer them to the D1 based on the effects available for that particular channel, as a compromise maybe with the naming of that channel. So, for example, the bass drum is the only channel that has distortion on it, but I may want to distort a snare, for example. So there may be conflicts between what you usually like to keep in a track compared to the effect you want to apply to it. Also, there's no subfolder support here for the samples that you do place in each folder. So for example, these are the snares that are in here now, and I'm told previews will be added. But if you actually want to start using that 4 gigabytes of storage, which is great, you might find yourself scrolling quite a while. It also adds cognitive load to remember which channels have which effects. We talked about the distortion on the bass drum channel. There's a high-pass filter, resonant high-pass filter on the snare drum. And the cool humanize effect is only available on certain tracks. Same goes for attack. Matching samples to folders to effects becomes quite a chore. Other things I found annoying that I hope they can fix: if you're working on a song and want to save your work, you need to save the song, the kit, and the 4 beats in individual steps each. Otherwise, you'll lose some or all of your changes. So you save your song here, and you save beats here and kits here. And this flexibility is great, but there should be one button that just saves everything. There's no real song mode. You can only chain 4 beats, each playing once. And beside that, something that's available on some of its competitors, it should be possible to record pitches in chromatically using the pads in a chromatic or in-key layout and using an external keyboard rather than having to use the knob or the automation. Then on the sync and latency side, it syncs up pretty nicely when it's the master clock, but there's about 14 milliseconds of latency when following an external clock, which I think is a bit much. There's also about 9 milliseconds of latency from when you hit a pad until when a sound comes out. If you're not a serious finger drummer, that may not be an issue. And then finally, regarding transferring samples, it's definitely a pro that there's an app to make doing that easy, and the fact that it syncs up real time is great. But there's no USB hard drive mode, so if at some point Donner drops support for this app, you might not be able to transfer new samples to the instrument. So that's it for the Donner Essential D1, a very interesting and hands-on drum machine for the price, especially if they deliver on the firmware updates. You'll find plenty of bonus sample content to feed any drum machine, as well as my ever-expanding book of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks on my Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.